Hello, I'm here with James Tsakalos, an internationally acclaimed NLP trainer and innovator who's been busy exploring, teaching and pushing the boundaries of NLP and more for over a decade. Along the way, he's learned from dozens of the world's best trainers, including both of the two co-creators of NLP, Richard Bandler and John Grinder, several well-known name brand trainers and a whole bunch of brilliant hidden gem trainers. He's driven by a passionate commitment to skill and innovation. James has personally introduced a number of new developments to the field, including his own Spiral Somatics and the 20-minute expertise rapid modelling process, contributing to his growing reputation as a rising star in the NLP world. Over the past decade, that reputation has grown steadily, and today there are several well-known NLP experts around the world who consider him to be among the best NLP trainers on the planet. Very much a trainer's trainer in the NLP game. One of the few genuine innovators in the field today, James is regularly asked to train in the UK, US, Asia and across Europe. Closer to home, he teaches NLP and some of its applications at all levels in his home city of Melbourne and continues to mentor some of Australia's best NLP trainers. James, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for agreeing to answer a few questions today. Now, I'll start, perhaps you're tired of this one, but when I first came across NLP, there was a popular book on the topic by one Joseph O'Connor called An Introduction to NLP. And I was trying to wrap my head around the subject, and it started, I seem to remember, with 3 pages of definitions. And
you want me to do one of those?
I remember, well, I remember at the time the one that made least sense to me, but now is really the only one that I use, was NLP is an attitude and a methodology that leaves behind a trail of techniques. I actually find that useful these days. So let's start there. Have you arrived at a definition of NLP that you're satisfied with?
I have. I've arrived at a couple of different definitions of NLP. The one that I use in my practitioner program is that NLP is about the detection and either utilization or replication of patterns in the processes of living systems, most notably human beings. So it's about detecting patterns and then either making use of those patterns or reproducing those patterns. So the core of NLP is modeling, which is about detecting and then reproducing patterns. But when people apply NLP, that's often to do with detecting and then leveraging patterns, making use of patterns, taking advantage of patterns that are there in people's behavior and thinking and that kind of thing.
Okay. And did you say you had another one? Yeah,
I have a much more straightforward one. There's like an intro course that I do called A Touch of Magic. It's 2.5 days. So it's just like intro level kind of stuff. And the way that I usually introduce it there, and with people just in conversation, if somebody asks me at a cafe or something, I'll usually go, well, do you know how like you can take 3 or 4 people that all have exactly the same skill, exactly the same training, let's say, in some skill, and exactly the same experience, but one of them just seems to be a natural. It just seems to come more easily to them. They seem to operate on a higher level. They seem to be gifted or whatever it might be. When you find people who seem to be naturals, who seem to be just naturally gifted at something, who seem to be, the word that I use most often is freaks. Actually, I like people that are just freaks in their field. There's people that are good, and then there's people that are just freaks, and nobody can explain how the hell is this person so good.
Yeah.
Usually those people can't explain what they do differently from anybody else.
Right.
It's just stuff that they do intuitively. But there's always stuff that they do consistently. It's just that they don't know that they do it, because there's very little that we are consciously aware of in our thinking, in our behavior. And NLP basically is about finding people like that, finding freaks who are just people who are freakishly skilled at something and finding out what they do that they themselves don't know that they do, that allows them to have that level of skill so that you can make that teachable.
I'm just sitting here thinking, could we model a highly hypnotizable person? They seem to have something that scientists have struggled to put their finger on for a while.
I reckon you could. I reckon that'd be a really fun thing to do, and I suspect that there's probably people out there in the world today that I don't necessarily know about, but I would suspect that there's probably people out there in the world today that that's how they approach hypnosis. They basically have modelled what makes someone highly hypnotizable, and then gone, okay, cool, so how do we create that? How do we transfer that?
Yeah.
You know, you yourself were mentioning earlier, not on this interview, of course, that if you consider hypnotizability, let's say, as a skill, then it's a skill that can be improved. You can teach people to be more hypnotizable.
Yeah.
And so it's just a case of reverse engineering, which is another really simple way of thinking about the essence of NLP, of modelling. It's reverse engineering behaviour, you know,
right.
And cognition and stuff like that. You just reverse engineer what needs to be there for someone to be highly hypnotizable, and then you just teach people how to do that.
Yeah. I mentioned the Carlton Skills training program, which was kind of that. It was a 70-minute process where those considered low and medium on the hypnotizability scale, or the suggestibility scale, if you want to look at it that way, watched a video of highly hypnotizables being taken through 12 suggestions, then watched the same video again with the subject narrating what they were doing, and 50% of those lows became highs. So it's almost
cool.
like an early modelling process from Spanos. I have met a number of your students on my trip to Australia, and a distinction that's come up a few times is that actually most of those that I've met don't call themselves therapists. They don't necessarily use the therapy frame in their efforts to change people's lives and improve their lot, their happiness. And I'm just wondering, is that partly your influence? Do you have an issue with the therapy frame? Do you think there are better frames for people who want to get rid of problems and take on more productive behaviours?
I don't have any issue with that frame. I do have an issue with people considering NLP a therapy,
right.
Because it's not. It's about reverse engineering. It's about accelerated learning. It's about reproducing genius. And
right.
So in the 70s, for example, in the early 70s, because one of the things about modelling that most people don't understand is because there's bugger all people in the world that actually have the first clue about how to model.
Yeah.
And that's just because of history and commercial interests and stuff. You know, nobody wants to. It's like the goose that lays the golden eggs. You know, people just want the golden eggs. They don't want to know how to look after the goose and how to breed, and they just give me an egg. You know.
And are the golden eggs in this sense equivalent to the trail of techniques?
Exactly. They'd be the things that kind of fall out of NLP. You know, because you model somebody, and the result of that is going to be some kind of process or technique or something like that. That gets a particular result, and people just want results in the world. You know, people don't want to know about modelling; they just want to know, how do I get this result?
Right.
And so, over decades, what's happened is that NLP trainers around the world have gradually stopped teaching modelling and started just teaching techniques, which is that's not NLP. That's what comes out of NLP.
Right.
And consequently, the people who then learn that stuff go on to be NLP trainers, and they never learned how to model, so they don't have the first clue. And so now you've got the majority of people in the world don't have the first clue how to model, but there are a handful that do, and there are a handful of modelers in the world, like myself.
Yeah.
And what they, there's certain things that we know that are kind of insider things that don't get talked about very much, and one of them is that modelling most often happens opportunistically. You know, it's not that you go and you set your intention to, I'm going to go seek out Elon Musk and I'm going to model Elon Musk. What happens is, I have someone in my sphere, my network or my extended network that I have access to, so I'm going to model that person, right? Because who's someone who's accessible to me, who's brilliant, who's a genius, who's a freak, because they're the people that you can get access to, they're the people you can model. And in the history of NLP, it just happens that in the very early days, the geniuses that these guys had access to were therapists, because Richard was working for a publishing company that published the books of Fritz Perls and Virginia Satir, so they had access to those guys, and so they modelled them. And then Gregory Bateson introduced them to Milton Erickson, because Gregory was a friend of Milton's from way back, and so they had access through their extended network to Milton Erickson. And so in the the 70s, these guys were out modelling these people and then teaching what they'd learned, and people would learn what they taught and go, oh, cool, so this NLP stuff is about therapy.
Yeah.
It's about how to do gestalt therapy or family therapy or hypnotherapy or whatever it might be. But then in later years, when people started doing modelling projects in business with influence skills and negotiation and management, and when people started modelling peak performance and athletes and stuff like that, it just expanded, because NLP is about the modelling. But what comes out of that is techniques for different things. So one of the things is that people have ideas about NLP on the basis of how they first were introduced to it. So therapists, when they get introduced to NLP, think of NLP as a therapy thing. People who are in sales roles, for example, and get introduced to NLP tend to think of NLP as an influence thing. Sports performers and stuff like that tend to think of NLP as a peak performance kind of thing. And so the attitudes, the ideas that people have kind of get driven by how you got introduced to NLP in the first place.
Yeah.
But that's all the surface stuff, that's all the techniques, it's all of the stuff that comes out of NLP. It's not the process of modelling itself.
Yeah.
So my people, they don't define themselves as therapists, because they're not. That's not what they do.
Right.
My mentor, when I first learned this stuff, my mentor was my first teacher as well. And his market was not therapists by a long stretch of the imagination. This is a guy that was a corporate bigwig in his previous career. He was divisional managing director of a multinational called Courtaulds in Australia. And a British company, but he was he was sent out to Australia.
Yeah.
And so when he was teaching NLP, he was teaching business applications of NLP. And so that's the stuff that I kind of cut my teeth on. And although I don't specialize in corporate stuff, most of the people that come to learn with me are people that are in business for themselves, small business owners and that kind of thing. I don't get a lot of therapists. So I go to the UK and it's weird for me.
Okay.
You get all of these people that are all therapists. That's not my normal kind of market,
Yeah.
So some of these guys that you've just recently met, some of these guys are coaches, but a lot of them are just people that are in business for themselves. Rob's a real estate agent, Pete's an accountant. They all do different things. Some of them work in larger organisations. Nathaniel was working in a larger organisation when he first started to come and train with me. Paul works for a large organisation to do with public transport in Melbourne. These are not therapists.
Right.
I do occasionally get one or two, but that's not usually my people.
Right. Yeah, that's actually, gone some way to answering another one of my questions, because my entry to it was kind of oblique via hypnosis and the massive emphasis, or at least it seemed to be a huge emphasis, on Erickson. It took quite a few years before I actually bothered digging into the work of Fritz Perls and Virginia Satir and seeing, so much of it is not actually Erickson's. But in the work I do, I obviously meet a lot of people who are experienced with NLP and who teach NLP, and I guess I've been surprised how little they kind of teach hypnosis. And I think I imagined that training by training, it had been squeezed out. But if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's not actually about Erickson and Satir and Perls. It's about the modelling exercise that they engaged in. Is that fair?
It's about that, and then it gets down to, when it comes to an individual NLP trainer, it's kind of down to your market as well. So, my market is people in small business. My mentor's market were senior execs in large organisations. When I did my practitioner course, I was surrounded by CEOs and managing directors and stuff, because that was Roger's market. But there are people whose market are therapists. There are people whose market are hypnotherapists, and so depending on the trainer, if they emphasize, if their market is a certain kind of person, then they're going to emphasize different kinds of things. So there are people that teach NLP that do really emphasize the hypnosis stuff. So Paul, for example, one of my students, is one of those. Yeah. Because he has a very deep and extensive interest in hypnosis. He was a hypnotherapist before he came to learn with me. Yeah. And so now that he's out teaching NLP, his NLP practitioner courses are very hypnotic. He incorporates a lot of hypnotic stuff into his NLP courses, a lot more than I do, for example. So it kind of varies by the trainer.
Yeah. But I get it. It doesn't have to be there if the modelling component is complete and strong.
Yeah, and usually there's going to be some kind of hypnotic stuff in there, simply because the Milton model, the model of us modelling us, like I was there, the model of us modelling Milton Erickson is historically significant, and there are certain models that are are usually presented in NLP courses because they're quite historically significant. And so the first few models, the meta model, the Milton model, rapport, representational systems, which itself is quite limited in application when you get right down to it, compared, like, there's lots
for
of...
sure. That was almost the
things,
most interesting part of it to fledgling, hypnotists and NLPers, and the eye movements, language predicates, it's not that it just doesn't seem to stand up to too much scrutiny. It's just, for me, it was when you're actually at the coalface doing hundreds of therapy sessions, you end up speaking and listening without necessarily speaking in this sort of slightly stilted language, which is perhaps just a poor effort to apply those models. But
and when it comes to representational systems, I've got two different frames on that. As a modeler, I find representational systems, particularly inside the model of neurological strategies, because that's where they're really interesting, are valuable when you're modeling kind of pure cognitive skills, mathematics and reading and that real kind of basic stuff. That stuff's quite useful. Right. But once you get outside the scope of that limited kind of range of skills, there's other things that are much better. And my first teacher, he sees the teaching of things like representational systems as particularly valuable because it gets people to actually pay attention to another human being in a much greater way than they probably had before.
Okay.
Because we spend so much of our time just kind of in our heads. Yeah. And when you teach people that people use all sorts of different language and they do different things with their body, and it's useful to pay attention to that, then
it encourages a sort of deeper listening and to get out of your own head.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
And there's a lot of value to that.
Okay. The industry itself, I mean, can we talk of an NLP industry? I think we probably can. Darren Brown, in one of his books, not that he's necessarily all-knowing about these things, but he did a bit of training, and there's a short clip of him on an NLP training course, described the industry as bloated at one point, which made me feel a little bit sick, but it seemed quite accurate. What's your view, if you want to share it, of the NLP industry?
There's two kind of elements to that. One is the field of NLP, and the other one is just business, And when it comes down to it, if you're in business, then as long as you're providing a service that people want, as long as you're providing value, then there's going to be a market for that kind of thing,
Yeah.
And I think there's a market for all sorts of stuff. I don't think that's, sometimes people get... people in my fields, like NLP trainers, get a little bit frightened, frankly, by new NLP trainers and by some of the cowboy trainers that come out and put thousands of people in a room and all that kind of stuff. And they kind of have this scarcity mindset of like, there's only so many to go around, and I think that's rubbish. I think as long as you're providing value to people, then there's always going to be a market. It's just a case of how well you do your job of putting yourself out there and getting clients and all that kind of stuff. But the field itself, the field of NLP, people sometimes talk about something called the NLP community, and I don't think that there is an NLP community. I think there are many NLP micro communities, but I don't think there is a community. I don't think there's any kind of sense of unity in the field, and I don't think there has been since Richard Bandler and John Grinder split, frankly. It was the original split. It's like the original sin in it's from then on, the world is different kind of thing. Right. And so you've got all these different kind of clubs and stuff. I personally have learned from trainers from various different schools of NLP, different styles and different approaches, because there's lots of different styles of NLP. There's lots of different approaches. And what often happens is people will be exposed to a certain style, a certain school, and they'll never kind of see beyond that. Then they'll never get out of that. There's a certain inbreeding that takes place in lots of schools of NLP. So there's heaps of people, for example, who have learned from Richard or have learned from some other Society of NLP trainer, and they've only ever learned from one person, or they've learned from lots of other Society of NLP trainers who all do the same kind of stuff. There's heaps of people who have, learned first from an NLP trainer, International NLP Trainers Association trainer, who subsequent to that may have learned from other people, but they're all NLP trainers. There's people who've trained with John Grinder and they've trained with other new codes trainers, and there's this kind of inbreeding that takes place, and I think that's really unhealthy. And people sometimes get these ideas that a certain school of NLP represents all of NLP, and that's just not the case.
Right.
So the people that I'm interested in are people that have, like me, learned from lots of different people, because that way you get a much broader perspective. It's a little bit like you.
Yeah.
You've learned Ericksonian approaches to hypnosis, but also direct hypnosis, street hypnosis, stage hypnosis, all sorts of stuff, And so you've got a much more well-rounded perspective on hypnosis, and I think that's a useful thing to do in any field.
Yeah, it's tough not to set up camp sometimes, and what it looked like is that there was a proliferation. I know we have to train trainers at some point, but almost a proliferation of courses, more advanced courses, trainers' trainings, and often people would get to the top of that pile, but hadn't really done a lot of change work, hadn't really applied it and rounded off the edges. And I think at that point, the temptation to just repeat or augment the notes that you were provided with just seems to happen.
Yeah, and I think you put your finger on something there. I don't necessarily agree that, for example, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I don't necessarily agree that anyone who wants to be an NLP trainer needs to be a therapist, because that's buying into the therapy frame. But I think whatever your market is, whichever people that you're going to teach, you need to have done that stuff. So if you're someone who is teaching NLP for applications in a corporate environment, then you need to have done that. You need to have applied NLP in a corporate environment and know what.
That's kind of what I mean. It doesn't have to be therapy, but
and I think that's quite valuable. And there's valuable. I think it's kind of essential.
Yeah.
But there's people that are just course junkies. They get onto courses and then they go to the next course and then they go to the next course. And there's value in learning from lots of different people, but there's an enormous amount of value to be had from just getting out there in the world and doing stuff. One of the things that I am always trying to encourage people to do with my courses is, when someone is training with me, my courses are unreasonably long. They're unusual in the field. I do like a 28-day practitioner course that's spread over several months, and so we do a few days and then there's a gap of a couple of weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. And in that time, people learn skills, and then I go, cool, go out into the world, use this stuff in the world, find out what you find out, and then come back, and then we'll debrief that, and then we'll add extra stuff. And I think that's really important, because if people aren't regularly going into the world and testing things and then coming back, then their skills don't have any basis in reality. It doesn't matter how good your trainer is. If the only thing that you ever do is you practice skills in a training room with other people who've been on the same course and know the intention of the exercise and have been given the instructions and know what you're trying to do, and are going to be generally nice to you and all that kind of stuff, then you're not going to get feedback the way things happen in the world. Because in the world, the people that you're going to be doing things with don't know what you're trying to do. They don't know the purpose of the exercise. They don't know any of those things.
Yep.
And so if you're not really clean with how you do things, if you're not responsive and adapting to randomness that happens in the world, then it's just not going to work. Like, one of the things that I frequently emphasize to people is that when you're in the world and when you're making use of any of these skills, it's nobody else's job to give you the responses that you want. It's nobody else's job to give you the answers to questions that you want. You have a conversation with someone, you ask them a question, you make a comment, and they're just going to respond to that however the hell they do, because they're a human being. They're going to go off on tangents, all sorts of stuff's going to happen. Like, you're not going to get expected responses every time. People in the world aren't going to follow the script. Whereas in the training room, you can do an exercise and it's almost as if people follow the script. I hate scripts, by the way, so I'm using that term metaphorically. But so it's so important to get out into the world and practice things in the world, because that way you find out what the limits are, and you find out what needs to be there in order for a particular process to actually play out the way that you want it to play out, for you to get the results that you want to be able to get. You get exposure to all of the different variables that happen in real life, because real life is messy.
Yeah.
And you don't get that in a training room. No matter how good your trainer is, if you're not out in the world doing stuff, you're not going to develop the skills that you need to develop.
Yeah. Yes. I've heard Jürgen Rasmussen passionately give that argument himself. And it's similar in kind of martial arts. People get locked into a lineage and then wonder why people aren't throwing straight punches when they don't do their system. Okay, so I know you continue to train, you continue to seek out training, which is refreshing given your experience. Do you have a greatest influence or a couple of names that have stood out for you more than others? You've mentioned you had an initial trainer who became a mentor.
Yes. Yeah, my greatest influence is definitely my primary mentor, the recently late Roger Dina. And he's someone who I was just really lucky. Like I happened to be in the right place at the right time. There were a couple of really good trainers in Melbourne, and I didn't realise this. I didn't think Melbourne was any different from anywhere else, And so I ended up learning from this guy, and it's my first trainer. I didn't have any kind of point of comparison.
And when was that?
Late 90s.
Okay.
And I, like everybody else, my first trainer, I didn't have a point of comparison. I couldn't compare him to anything else.
Yeah.
And so he would assure us that this was good training, and other people would assure us that this was good training. But you kind of take that with a grain of salt, because you've got no baseline, you've got no reference to anything else. And it really wasn't until years later that I started teaching, particularly that I started teaching overseas, and being exposed to people who had done lots of training with lots of different trainers, including some very famous name trainers, that I came to recognise that Roger's training was spectacular. His standards were just miles beyond the norm. And so what was normal for me wasn't normal for the vast majority of the NLP community.
Yep.
And I think that was due in large part to his mentor, a guy called Marvin Oka, who again had just really high standards. And I think that was just because he was a freak. He used to be a professional stage magician, and so kind of approaches everything with a certain commitments to mastery and obsessiveness and perfectionism and that kind of thing. And so Roger, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to complete an apprenticeship, a trainer apprenticeship with Roger full time for about 5 years. So most people in the NLP field, they learn from one person, and they do a short course, and then they do another short course, and then they do another short course, and now they're a trainer, and they've had maybe 20 days worth of training.
Yep.
And I had thousands of hours, before I kind of struck out on my own, because I had years in apprenticeship with Roger, and it was really masterful. And since then,
so you could kind of shadow his work that he was doing, or
so that I could just learn from him, learn my craft as a trainer, because he was masterful as a trainer.
Right.
Not just a trainer of NLP, he's just masterful at helping people learn stuff.
Yeah.
And which is a little bit different. There's lots of people that are good at NLP, but they suck as trainers.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to name any names, but there are people out there that are great at what they do, and I would much prefer to model them than go to a course where they were teaching.
Okay.
Because they're two different skill sets,
Right.
And but Roger was definitely my biggest influence, and having since learned from a lot of famous names and other people, he's pretty masterful. I do have a lot of respect for others as well, though. John Grinder, for example, is someone who has. I have a lot of respect for John. He's extraordinary. I think he's just always going to be on his game.
Right.
He's very rigorous in the way that he does things. He's also very quirky as well. He's got his own kind of ways of doing things, and there's a little bit of this is how things should be done, and this is how things should not be done. But he's a great exemplar of someone who's very rigorous. I also have a lot of time for a guy called Jonathan Altfeld, who's a friend of mine from Florida. And he is someone I think he was the first, possibly even the only Society of NLP trainer, SNLP trainer that I've met, who actually knows how to train. So when people go to do trainers trainings with Richard Bandler, for example, they don't learn how to train, they learn how to present. They learn how to be on stage in front of a group of people, to elicit states, to tell stories, to do anchoring and stuff. But that's just one element of training.
Yeah.
And they don't have a lot of other stuff. What they have is great presentation skills. But Jonathan has great trainer skills. He thinks like a trainer. He approaches design like a trainer, designing sets of experiences and debriefing those experiences. He's pretty good. I suspect he may have gotten those chops from Rex Sykes, who was a big influence on him. So I've got a lot of respect for Jonathan because he's a trainer. He's not just someone who does NLP. He's someone who is committed to the art of training and helping people develop skills.
Right.
And he's good at that.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had a couple of exchanges with him, and even just reading some of his posts available online, it's kind of rigorous detail and subtlety. This is someone who's definitely thought this through and played with it, consistently. And yeah, good. Thank you for that. So you mentioned standards, and I know this is something that's important to you, and your name came up again and again when I was sort of looking for best trainers. It literally over and over would come up. So I guess it has something to do with that. How would you kind of define, well, excellence or standards in training? I think you've kind of touched on a couple of variables, but just anything you can kind of say about that, what you kind of really hope your training would represent or come across.
Yeah. Once upon a time there was a woman called Cass Carter. Cass Carter is someone who barely knew me, I barely knew her. We'd met maybe on a couple of occasions, but she influenced me quite profoundly in terms of how I think about standards. She wasn't an NLPer. She didn't have anything to do with NLP or hypnosis or anything like that. I had a friend back in the day, we've kind of drifted out of contact, but he's still around, called David, who ran a bookshop in Melbourne called the Esoteric Bookshop. And this was a place, and he had an interest in NLP and hypnosis, and so of a Wednesday it would be a kind of a ritual thing. I'd go and hang out and we'd have copies and we'd just talk shit, basically, And so, but he had this shop, and it wasn't just a bookshop. It was kind of a hub for the neo-pagan community in not just Melbourne but in Australia. And so they had, all sorts of people that espouse neo-pagan beliefs, that worship nature and that practice, things like Wicca and all that kind of stuff would go into this shop for their stuff. And so there'd be books there, but they'd also have other things. They'd have herbs, they'd have oils, they'd have all sorts of bits and pieces, And so there were people there that practiced what they would describe as magic. So there's the setting. Here's Cass Carter. Cass Carter is someone who is a professional writer. She wrote for some prominent television shows in Australia, but she was also someone who was a neo-pagan. She was someone who was an expert in Celtic mythology and tarot, and was a self-professed witch. And so she, every now and then, she'd come and hang out in this place. And I don't know if you remember this, but in the late 1990s, there was some pop culture stuff that happens that kind of emphasized this pagan obsession with magic and stuff like that. There was this movie called The Craft. There was a television show called Buffy the Vampire Slayer, in which there were demons and witches and all that kind of stuff. And so in that period of time, there was all of a sudden this massive influence among young people, young women in particular, in these kinds of things. And so my friend David did lots of business because he, all of these people coming into his shop and whatnot. Who were inspired by watching this movie, The Craft, and wanted to learn to spell to change the colour of their eyes, because they hadn't heard of contact lenses, presumably. So anyway, this one time, Cass Carter was there. She was in the Esoteric Bookshop, and sitting regally the way that she would sit, she was someone who had this incredible presence, and she would just hold court, And I was just hanging out talking to David. And this young lady was in the shop, and she was looking around, and she was flustered. And she had a bundle full of products and various different bits and pieces. And she came up to the front counter, and she's flustered. And David asked her what was wrong, and could he help? And she said, "I'm really looking for this particular herb. I need to find this herb, and you don't seem to have it here." And David was explaining that, well, because of certain laws, there are certain herbs that we can import and other herbs that we can't, we're not allowed to, and that's one of the ones that we can't get. And she was really flustered. She said, but I need this herb. How can I get this herb? And he said, well, what do you need it for? And she said, well, I've got this book and there's this spell in this book that I want to do, and it requires all of these things, and I've got everything, but I don't have this herb. And at that point, I overheard Cass Carter turn to this girl and say, my dear girl, what I hope that you'll one day learn is that when it comes to magic, if you can't do it empty-handed, you can't do it. And that just resonated in my brain, because I was learning NLP at the time, and I was considering going down the path of becoming a trainer, and it just stuck in my brain, and I went, yeah, this is what it's about. This is, because there are so many people who, they've learned techniques, they've learned, kind of set routines that I say this and I say this, and I've got these magic words and all that kind of stuff. And if that's how you do things, then you don't know how to do this stuff, right? If you can't improvise, if you can't adapt, if you can't just spontaneously respond in the moment, if you can't do, if you need a quiet room somewhere to be able to run a particular process, then you can't do it. If you can't do it across a boardroom table, then you can't do it. If you can't do it in a coffee shop, you can't do it. If you can't do it in spite of the fact, so there's.
Yeah, it's great. I'll definitely be banking that one.
So this empty-handed NLP is what I'm all about. So I'm about people who understand how these patterns work, so that they can adapt to them. So if you take something like, for example, I indicated earlier, we were talking about the arrow technique, which is pretty cool. It's nice and elegant, and the first bit of that, structurally, that's the phobia cure, right? If what you think the phobia cure is you have this visualization in a cinema and you've got to run a movie backwards and all that kind of stuff, then you don't get the phobia cure, right? This is something involving dissociation and a rapid analog shunt, and there's 1,000 different ways that you can do that.
Sure.
You were also talking about the 6-step reframe, or the N-step reframe, let's say. By the way, it probably says something about my character that I've taught this process 1,000 times, and I always teach it with a varying number of steps. I've taught it with everything between 2 and 14 steps, but never 6. It's a matter of personal pride for me.
In fact, it's very rare that we have 6. It's just that we had a room full of NLP practitioners, and I assume they were taught the 6-step reframe, which is that's great. Are we done with Cass?
Sure.
That's an excellent line, an excellent lesson right there. Let's have a look. You have created some stuff. I don't necessarily want to shoehorn it into the world of NLP. Quite possibly gone beyond it. Could you tell us a little bit about the 2 processes that I mentioned at the beginning, the Spiral Somatics and your 20-minute modelling process?
Gotcha. Okay. I just had to wait for the second thing, because I couldn't remember what you said at the beginning. Because there's heaps of stuff that I've come up with. Okay. Spiral Somatics is it's my work, but it's my extension and refinement of the work of my mentor. So it didn't evolve out of nothing. It didn't emerge out of the ether or anything. It was absolutely influenced by the work of my mentor, Roger Dina, and I just took stuff that he was doing and took it a lot further than he ever did. And what that is fundamentally about is the mind-body link, and it's really kind of a different field. I teach it as part of some of my training, but it's not strictly speaking NLP. You could consider it to be part of a modelling project or the result of a modelling project, but it's really kind of something different, and it's about the body-mind connection. So most people are quite aware of the fact that the body and mind are part of the same system. You see someone looking all slumped, and the corners of their mouth turned down and looking down, and that kind of stuff, then they're probably not feeling great. So people have got some references in terms of, you can get a snapshot of the state of mind that someone is in right now on the basis of their physiology.
Right, so it's not quite your usual body language, this means that, it's more kind of instinctive, is it? Or?
No, it goes beyond that. So that stuff that I was talking about, that's what most people are familiar with.
Yeah, okay.
Most people are familiar with the fact that the way that you hold your body affects how you feel, the way that you feel affects how you hold your body, etc. But it goes so much further than that. There's literally nothing inside of you, in your internal experience, that is not communicated in your body.
Okay.
So not just your state of mind right now, right? But when people come and learn Spiral Somatics, you'll learn how to, the moment that someone walks through a door that you've never met before, like without even saying the words to them, like just in terms of how they're holding themselves and paying attention to some very particular things, very particular elements of physiology, you can make some pretty good educated guesses as to what's important to this person in the world, in life, what their priorities are, what their beliefs are about life, the universe and everything, what their opinions are likely to be about certain kinds of topics, the sorts of things that are likely to light them on, light them up, turn them on, turn them off, the aptitudes they're likely to have, the things that they're likely to be good at, the things that they're likely to be not so good at, the kinds of people that they're likely to get on with in different sorts of ways, how they're likely to respond in different sorts of situations. There's just an enormous amount of stuff that's right there in everyone all the time in terms of how they're using their body.
Right.
And that's one half of Spiral Somatics, because that's the outside-in side of Spiral Somatics,
right.
which is the being able to see that stuff in other people. But because the body and mind are part of the same system, what this means is that when you learn to develop a lot of control over your body and over very particular elements of how you use your body, then you can use your own body and your control of your own body as a way of being able to develop much greater flexibility, not just in terms of your behavior and not just in terms of the way that you do things in the world, but to develop a lot of flexibility in terms of how you fundamentally are, how you identify, how you, the kinds of beliefs and values and attitudes that you hold, so that you can have flexibility not just of behavior, but in flexibility of identity, ontological flexibility. And that's what it's really about, because there's so many people. I guarantee that anyone listening to this right now has heard someone at some point in their life say, "Oh, I couldn't do that," or "I'm just not that kind of person." But you can be that kind of person when you know how to change how you identify, how you do your identifying, and just be whoever you need to be in a moment. Not just doing different things, not just pretending, not just doing the behaviors of that kind of person, but just being that kind of person.
Right.
When someone says, "Well, that just wouldn't be me," right? Well, just be the you who that would be.
Right.
So, but it's easy to say that, but without a method of going there, then that's easier said than done. And Spiral Somatics is a method of going there. It's a way of developing that kind of flexibility of identity, so that your sense of who you are and who you are not shifts, so that who you are becomes so much more, and you have a lot more flexibility of who you are as a person, basically.
Right. And is that something you teach standalone, or is it always part of your practitioner?
I teach it standalone. I've been teaching it standalone overseas since 2007.
Okay.
In Australia, up until recently, I've only taught it as part of my master practitioner training, but I've just started teaching that standalone in Australia as well.
Right.
So I'll be back in the UK, for example, teaching it in June.
Okay. Is that with James Tripp, or is he hosting you? Or?
Yeah, he's bringing me out.
Okay.
So I've got a lot of time for James.
Yes. So that will be a Spiral Somatics training.
Spiral Somatics training. It'll be in Edinburgh.
Okay.
And although I'll pop down to London and just to hang out and catch up with people and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But we'll be based in Edinburgh.
Great. What motivates you to keep creating? You said you'd mentioned you've created some other bits and pieces, and you said to me that you want to spend, or at least park some of your time for the purpose of creating things. So what's kind of motivating you in that regard to continue to do that?
I think this is just a belief that I have. It's just something that I think, and so of course I think I'm right about it, but I could be completely wrong about it. I think the urge to create is just kind of a natural thing. I think everybody has an urge to create something or other, whether it's it's building a shed out the back, or creating a piece of music, or drawing, or writing something, or doing a project at work, or bringing something into the world with your efforts, and that you can then look at and go, "Oh, I did that. There you go. There's this thing." So I personally think it might not be true for everybody else. It's certainly true for me. I've got a bit of that going on. I like doing that kind of thing. Yeah. And I tinker quite a lot. But the other thing is that I'm never satisfied. I'm never satisfied with what I do, and I'm always trying to find better ways of doing things, and more efficient ways of doing things, and more elegant ways of doing things. So I'm constantly experimenting and constantly refining and constantly kind of working towards, like if I was a software developer, I'm always working towards version 2, version 3, version 4, version 5, version 6, and it just never ends.
So a big part of your creative process, if you like, is just you're dedicated to continuous improvement.
Pretty much, yeah, in everything. So, for example, like one of the things that you demonstrated a couple of days ago, this may not necessarily have been your intention, but I just took a snapshot and went, oh, that's cool, that's something to play with for the purposes of training people in rapport, which I define as a state of unconscious responsiveness between people.
Okay.
And that's that technique called the bridge.
Bridge by Aaron Alexander. Yeah, great little technique. Do you have any routines or rituals in your, I guess mainly that apply to your work, your life? Do you do stuff to get into a particular state when you're going to be training people, or when you're going to be creating, or do you wake up and jump into a freezing cold plunge pool? Anything like that you think could be of interest or.
Could be of interest. I don't know if it's of interest. I've got certain rituals, so in terms of creating and stuff, I'm a big fan of shower thoughts. Hashtag shower thoughts. I'm stealing that from Jono, who you just met earlier. Showers are great places to have ideas, but then you need to kind of take them out of the shower and into other things. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of using whiteboards, so I use whiteboard space like crazy. I'm constantly kind of doing diagrams and notes and things on whiteboards. It's kind of an externalization of my brain, as it were. And I also have rituals in terms of getting into to kind of training mode, as it were. There's a thing that I do. I'll set up my own training room. I like to set up my own training room because I'll come into some kind of room and it won't be perfect. It won't be set up ideally as a training room, and so I'll just physically arrange the space. Yeah. I'll set some chairs up. I'll move things around until such time as it looks and it feels like a training room. And the process of doing that is like kind of rearranging my brain as well.
Great.
It's like I'm kind of setting my brain up while I'm setting the room up, setting the space up. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of that kind of process. Kind of physical metaphors are really powerful things.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, some other slightly left field questions, and you've already given me a lovely quote from Cass there. What is another favourite quote? Something that has had an impact on you and you're perhaps prone to repeating now and again?
Robert Anton Wilson. I don't believe anything, but I have many suspicions. One of the things I strongly suspect is that a world independent of, or at the very least external to my senses, exists in some sense.
Right.
I don't believe anything, but I have many suspicions.
Great. I love it. Is there a book that you find yourself recommending more than others? Not necessarily a book about NLP or this world we've kind of met in. It could be fictional. Is there a book?
There is, because every now and then, I generally don't recommend that people learn something like NLP by reading. I think that's a terrible thing to do,
right?
Because it's such a full body sport. You need to kind of get in and do stuff. And when you read, if you haven't had live experience, you've got a book in front of you, and you've just got dots on a page that you then needs to interpret. You need to kind of make up these ideas in your mind of what you think that probably means, and so you create these kind of movies inside your mind that you've just completely made up. It's not actually based on real experience, and it could be completely off track, And then when you later come into an actual live environment, that can sometimes kind of get in the way of you actually operating effectively in that environment. So I recommend that people read after they've got some good training under their belt, after they know what they're doing, because then reading can kind of augment the stuff that you know. But every now and then people will ask, they'll insist, they'll go, surely there's something that I can read before I come and learn your stuff.
Yeah.
And so I will, in all seriousness, say yes, there's a series of textbooks. They start with a book called Witches Abroad by Terry Pratchett.
Right.
And then I believe the next one is Lords and Ladies, also by Terry Pratchett, and then Masquerade by Terry Pratchett, and then Carpe Jugulum by Terry Pratchett. It's a series of books involving a trio of witches. And Terry Pratchett, for those who are not familiar with him, shame on you. And he was an absolute master of his craft. He's hilarious. He writes like fantasy comedy kind of stuff, but his work is very deeply insightful about human beings and how they work, and his witches in particular are just experts in human behavior and navigating human behavior and making use of that stuff. And I personally think that the ultimate NLPer, the ultimate NLP practitioner, is an even combination of the characters of Granny Weatherwax and Nanny Ogg, these two senior witches in these books.
Great. I need to dig into some Terry Pratchett. I'll take the hint.
You will never look back.
Do you get to work with kids or teenagers, or do you train people to kind of do that kind of thing? I know you said it's mostly small businesses. I'm just interested really if there's something, of value that you might have to say to help young people understand more about themselves or the world, or
the thing that's kind of most personal for me, I guess. I've done a little bit of work with kids and teenagers, and I've trained some people who have done work with kids and teenagers. But the thing in particular that really gets me as a modeler is that the school system and school teachers, as well-intentioned as they are, approach education from a particular frame, for a particular model of the world, and particularly like early education, young kids. So there's certain really fundamental skills like maths and reading and spelling and stuff like that the way that we teach kids is just insane from a modeler's perspective, right? If I want to learn how to do something, then I'll find someone who already does that and does it well, and reverse engineer how do you do that, and then I'll do that, But the way that we approach teaching kids, we don't do that. We start with the assumption that kids need to learn certain things first, and then other things next, and then other things next. Right. And it's perfectly well intentioned, but it's a slow process because kids are capable of extraordinary things. So there was a young lad of 3 years old that I was with at a certain point in time who wanted to learn to read like his brother, and he could only identify four words at that point, and he wanted to learn how to read. And so rather than going through the standard thing, because what people usually do is they'll start and they'll go, okay, well first, before we get into reading, the child has to learn the alphabet, so he needs to teach them this set of symbols that don't mean anything, right? The letter A doesn't mean anything. It's nothing. It's an abstract concept. The letter B, the letter C, the letter F, the letter Q, the letter T, they're just these abstract concepts. Right? For a small child, abstract concepts is not where they live. Right? You're introducing this stuff that doesn't mean anything. But then you introduce the fact that this visual symbol represents a sound, phoneme, which is also something that doesn't mean anything. So you're teaching them this thing that doesn't mean anything on its own, but it symbolizes something else that also doesn't mean anything on its own. And you think that we have to start like this before we can get kids to the point where they can read. Right. But that's not how you gradually get them to recognize that this letter represents this sound. And so then you have kids learn to read by looking at individual letters and learning how to sound things out, spell things out, and that kind of stuff. But that's not how an adult reads. That's not like anyone who knows how to read, who is skilled in the art of reading. Right. You don't read letter by letter. Nobody reads letter by letter. Right? You look at a word and you know what the word is. You recognize that word because that word is a visual shape. Right? It's a visual shape. There's no inherent difference between the visual shape of a word and the visual shape of somebody's face, and the visual shape of a letter of the alphabet, and the visual shape of it. They're just shapes. All we're doing is we're doing shape recognition. And as adults, you do shape recognition with a word. Right? You take kids and you think, well, kids can't learn, what this whole word, we've got to teach them individual letters first because that's a simpler way to do it. It's an insane way to do it from my perspective because that's not how fluent readers read. And kids can recognize an immense amount of visual shapes. Any kid that watches a TV show that's got 7 or 8 different characters on it, they can tell you exactly which character's who, right? They can recognize all sorts of things.
It's just as complicated as the word bird or
exactly.
Pet. Yeah.
So there's lots of examples like that in the school system where we do our best to break things down into bite-sized pieces to make it as easy as possible for a child to learn something. But they can actually learn a lot faster than that. They learn a lot faster than we sometimes give them credit. And then sometimes we'll do things like we'll give kids strategies for doing things that work well for a parent or for a teacher. So reading, for example, one of the things about reading is that in terms of reading efficiently, in terms of reading quickly, for example, one of the things that slows down people's ability to read is that they subvocalize, right? You look at words on a page on the outside, and then you repeat those words to yourself inside your head. Like you say to yourself what you're reading. And then typically you'll make, pictures and sounds and stuff inside your head. But the sub-vocalizing, the talking to yourself about this stuff, is something that gets in. It's a slow thing. If you want to read fast, then you take that bit out. But it's only there in the first place because it gets installed in kids, not because it helps the kids learn how to read, but because it helps teachers and parents be able to recognize whether or not the child is able to read. Right? Because it's a feedback mechanism. So, little kids, when you're reading, you read things out loud. Right? And the benefit of reading something out loud is that a parent or a teacher can follow along and can tell whether or not you're actually reading. Right? It's an important feedback mechanism for the teacher or the parent. But what that means is that you read out loud and your reading strategy starts with learning to read out loud, and then eventually you're going to reading but quietly. Right? So you're going to silent reading where you just do it inside your head, right? And you're doing the same strategy. You're looking at something on the outside and then talking, but you're just doing it inside your head. Right? And so most people have got this particular reading strategy just because of the way that people are taught to read very early. Just because it works as a feedback mechanism for parents and teachers, not because it's an efficient strategy.
Very interesting. I'm trying to learn Portuguese at the moment, and most of the books start with a whole bunch of letters that I don't know, let alone I can sound out. I'm going to turn to page 60 and start there. Okay, so let me fire this one at you. If you related to your work here and your aspirations, what you want to do, where you think you can have most impact, if you got the dream phone call related to your work, your red rope customer, as a friend of mine, Scott Grossberg, once put it, who would be on the other line and why?
As a customer?
Well, yeah, who would you like to work with, I guess?
Okay, because that wouldn't be my dream phone call.
Okay.
But who would I like to work with? I'd like to work with the people that I'm working with now, because my business is, it's almost all word of mouth. And one of the cool things about that is that you get really cool people and they refer you, people that are in their social network, people that are kind of like them. So you get more really cool people. So I just keep on getting really cool people in my life. I love that,
Okay.
I think that's a great way of getting really cool people.
So you're happy there. Who would be your dream phone call?
My dream phone call would be a phone call from a student or a student's student or a student's student's student, letting me know that they were taking these skills and they were sharing these skills and spreading this stuff out into the world.
You've played a hand in that at some level, and it's spreading and doing good things.
Yeah.
Great.
That's pretty much it.
Okay, let's leave it there.
All right. Thank you.
Really
very much.
appreciate it, James. Very insightful. And I'm going to come and join you in June in the UK.
Great. Look forward to it.
Thanks a lot.